Our next presenters are here to talk about a little something called America and our 250th birthday. You may notice that there are flags up here. Some people were troubled that the Maryland flag was in the middle. We'll explain. As is protocol, the United States flag has its place of honor as the first flag on our right. The flags are in the order of the 13 colonies joining and forming the United States of America. So I'm not going to look behind me, but I assume the Pennsylvania flag is second. Colin, is it two? Good. All right, we're good. We did it right. So that's why there are this array of state flags here. We now are going to have a discussion about America 250, why we're here, how we got here, and what the future holds for the American experiment. We have two presenters with us today, one of which we know very well. One is the Honorable Keith Rothfus. Keith was a member of Congress representing most of southwestern Pennsylvania, and in effect representing all of us in the United States Congress. After his service in Congress, he's continued to remain involved in events like these, volunteering his time and expertise, writing and speaking out on public policy issues. He's also proud to be a dad and a grandpop. Joining him in the discussion is Professor Matthew Spalding. Professor Spalding is with Hillsdale College, where he's a professor not only of political science, but also serves as the dean of their College of Government. In addition, he is an author, including a number of books, one of which written this past fall. His focus is on America, its greatness, our history, the truths that we hold to be self-evident. There are two very thoughtful gentlemen with us today. Hopefully will teach us a thing or two and help us all to remember, while we're at this conference, why the American experiment is that shining city on the hill. We welcome to the stage Congressman Keith Rothfus and Professor Matthew Spalding.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I think we're on. Good. That's loud and clear. It's good to be back. Good to welcome my friend, Dr. Spalding, up from Hillsdale College. Welcome to the place where the Declaration was debated and signed. We're here to talk about a book that Dr. Spalding has just written. It actually won the Conservative Book of the Year Award. So I hope we're going to get this up, if we can, maybe the QR code, and I really recommend the book. But the title is The Making of the American Mind, the story of our Declaration of Independence. Where's that title come from?
Well, first, hello to all of you, and great to be with you, my old friend Keith. The book's called The Making of the American Mind, and the reference there is actually to a letter that Jefferson wrote in 1825, where he said, "I didn't mean to invent a bunch of new ideas. This didn't kind of spring out of my head. I meant it to be an expression of the American mind." And I take that to mean, which he writes about, that he was understood to be the drafter of these American ideas that had been percolating and growing and debating for a number of years in the Continental Congress. And he wanted to capture it, which he did beautifully in this document, the Declaration of Independence. Wonderful writer, but then there was a committee. John Adams and Ben Franklin were on the committee, and then the Continental Congress edited it more, cut about 25%, which didn't make Jefferson happy, and created this wonderful document. And then in the heat of the moment, and this is the story I wanted to tell, which is why I wanted to put this book together, especially in this anniversary year. In the heat of the moment, they were literally, you can see what was going on here. At the precise moment, the British are sending ships from Nova Scotia to New York, Washington to New York, seeing them coming. It was exactly the same moment. The same day, July 2nd, they passed independence, and then the 4th, when they passed the Declaration, the British are landing troops on Staten Island and preparing to invade, and Washington's reporting on that. So that story is what I wanted to capture. But behind that are all these ideas that have been percolating and growing and debated as Americans come to define themselves as a people separate from the British. And it's captured in this document, which is truly an expression of the American mind. And I think it actually is still an expression of the American mind, although today highly debated.
Yeah, so the American mind just didn't happen in a vacuum. There was this soup, this milieu, this context in which the founders knew the culture that they were coming out of. You write in the book that the American mind in 1776 was dominated by different but harmonizing denominations of biblical Christianity. You also cite the importance to the founders of the Western canon, going back as far as Aristotle in Greece and Cicero in Rome. Why are these important to the story, and what is about them that the founders would have been steeped in?
No, it's actually crucially important. Today, when we study the founding and the Declaration in particular, it's often taught as, well, the Declaration is a modern document. These are modern Enlightenment ideas. And it's very deistic. There's no theology. There's no influence, least of all Christianity. And that turns out to just not be true. And that's why I wanted to emphasize this longer and deeper traditions that we're feeding into the Declaration. Obviously, the British traditions, we were British before we became Americans. But then deeply beyond that, there's a powerful influence from the classics, Aristotle and Cicero in particular. Cicero turns out to be very important. They all knew Latin. And if you studied Latin, you studied Cicero. And they all studied the law, which meant you studied Cicero. That's the beginning of the natural law tradition. And then, of course, the Christian tradition itself. The sermons, it turns out, are extremely important and influential in shaping that American mind. And they come together. That's the amazing miracle in many ways of the American founding. The first paragraph of the Declaration refers to their standard, which was the laws of nature and of nature's God. The laws of nature, that harkens back to the natural law, which is actually grounded in the classics. The laws of nature's God, the same laws, are also those laws you can understand through man's mind as general revelation. And then God comes back in the Declaration several times. We are created equal. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. And then, of course, divine providence, and He's supreme judge of the world. So there's clearly a classical influence and a theological and more generally Christian influence on the Declaration that we have forgotten and the modern universities do not teach.
Well, yeah, forgotten. I was asking you earlier, how many American high school students would even hear the word Cicero in a history class? And probably none. And yet,
probably, we were saying probably zero, but yet that influence is so important because from Cicero and Aristotle, you get the notion that man is metaphysically free and reasons and thinks. And then from Christianity, you get this notion that man is created in God's image. God created man to reason and think. And you bring them together, it's dynamite.
You do a very good job in the book, parsing out. It's almost like an annotated version of the Declaration. You have your annotated Bibles, but this is the annotated version of the Declaration where there's substance behind each of the paragraphs, and you do a good discussion of the grievances against the king.
But part of it is we don't necessarily read the whole document anymore. You read the few famous phrases, but you don't actually study the whole thing. It's actually a wonderful document thought through. It's more like a symphony. All the pieces go together, different tones and sounds, but they all come together in one harmony.
Some things in the passive voice, some things in the active voice. He really does an excellent job parsing everything out. And it's important to understand what is going on in the Declaration because that's how you got our country. That's these truths on which it was founded. And you see this resurrection in the time of Lincoln, who really hearkened to the Declaration. Maybe talk a little bit about Lincoln's reverence for the Declaration and his revival of the understanding of it. First of all, to your general point, the Declaration and the Constitution are two sides of the same coin. They're always intended to be together, one argument, because one is our framework, how we limit government, how we arrange government. The other one are the deeper principles behind it in the Declaration. What the Declaration does, especially, is it gives us this grounding in these moral truths. I always like to point out to my students, it says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. It doesn't say, we have some personal value propositions we'd like to share with you. It's a truth claim, as we would say. That's something extremely important in today's world of subjective
and relativistic truths.
In the skeptical view of the Declaration, or it's an old parchment. Maybe it meant something in 1776. It really is not relevant to today. The progressive movement that really tried to undermine that document. There was one of these historians, Carl Becker, in the early part of the 20th century, who wrote really the definitive book on the Declaration.
It's very well written. Wonderful book.
And that was an education for generations of people. But he wrote, to ask whether the natural rights philosophy of the Declaration is true or false is essentially a meaningless question. And so you say in your book, it is hard to imagine, especially on the verge of war, that the signers of the Declaration ever thought that the truth or falsity of their clause was a meaningless question.
No, that's right. I mean, the modern progressive kind of completely ignores the basis of all these arguments. There are no truths. It's all historical. It's merely opinions. And going back to your point about Lincoln, what Lincoln saw, and the founders themselves saw, but Lincoln especially saw, is that there's a truth there, and that truth is something we can go back to. And he did it in the case of the battle over slavery. Because the claim that all men are created equal was the death knell of the argument for slavery. But it was because it was based on a moral truth that he could see. He famously wrote a letter later. He said, "All honor to Jefferson, the man who, in the heat of the moment, in a merely revolutionary document, placed there an abstract truth applicable to all men and all times as a stumbling block for future tyranny." Yeah. That's a mind that understands the meaning of the Declaration in a very powerful way. And in the same way, I think, given the challenges in today's society, given the moral collapse of our culture, given the direction of our universities, in the same way that we need to go back to the Declaration. Yeah. It's a great bridge. Yeah. It's a beautiful in of itself. It's the American Revolution, a great thing, but it's a bridge back to this understanding of truth.
And didn't Lincoln say something to the effect of, if you have been taught things contrary to the precepts in this great document, I entreat you to
go back to the Declaration. Return to the Declaration. Yeah, there's a long passage that my book begins with, that long description he has. What's interesting there, and very providential, he says, "Don't mind me. I don't matter. You can do anything you want with me, but go back to the Declaration. Return to those sacred principles."
And here we are, just a short drive over to Philadelphia, where this all happened, right here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Your book ends with a chapter called Iron Men. Why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to do, I wanted to write this book. I wanted to point towards these truths and these ideas, but I also wanted to make it come alive as a story. We teach history, and great history has to come alive. You can't merely be dead history, flat history. And one of the ways I wanted to do that was to bring these men to life, these signers, these 56 signers. And in a very famous speech in 1858, going back to Lincoln, it's on July 10th, so it's around the 4th of July. He pauses and he wants to talk about the Declaration. And in passing, he refers to them as Iron Men. And I was like, why? At one point, George Washington goes to Philadelphia to talk to them about potentially writing a declaration. And he reminds them, he writes in a letter at the time that you're either going to do this or you're going to suffer the punishment, which is hanging, et cetera, et cetera. And I always wondered what et cetera meant. And it turns out the punishment under British law for treason was to be hanged, then drawn, and then quartered. It was still the old feudal punishment. So these guys, in the heat of the moment, knowing that they're about to be invaded by the strongest and most powerful country in the world, the invasion of Long Island was larger than the Spanish Armada and was the largest naval invasion until you get to World War II. That's significant. In the heat of the moment, they signed this document knowing that's what the punishment was. One of them is shot at a battle. Reverend Witherspoon, who's a chaplain but also a signer from New Jersey, his son was killed by a cannonball at the Battle of Germantown. John Morton, one of his sons, they captured and tortured him because his father signed the Declaration. He died on one of the infamous prison ships, which meant his body was dumped in the eastern harbor of New York. The stories are very amazing. They chased them down, they tracked them, they tried to find them. They tried to capture Jefferson twice. They sent regiments to try to capture Jefferson at Monticello and at Richmond. All the signers from New York, every one of them, they sent to try to find them at their homes. Francis Lewis, I think it was his name, lived out on Long Island. They went there to capture him. He wasn't home. His wife Elizabeth was home. She refused to surrender. So they sent it was surrounded by a regiment of mounted cavalry, and a ship in the Long Island harbor opened fire until she surrendered. She was captured by the British and held hostage to try to get her husband to turn himself in or to renege on the Declaration. She was only released after Washington intervened and forced a prisoner exchange. So these are these great stories. Robert Morris, the famous financier of the Revolution, he gave the equivalent of what by today's dollars would be $32 million, his own wealth. He gave it to the Revolution. At one point, he was writing personal checks and personal notes to finance the Revolution. He died in debtor's prison. That's what I mean by Iron Man, what they did. And especially today when a lot of young people think that these were guys in tri-cornered hats and wore breeches and wore wigs, I want it to be thought differently.
Well, that kind of...
They put their lives on the line.
Yeah, and that brings back to that criticism that Carl Becker had again about whether the natural rights philosophy of the Declaration is true or false is essentially a meaningless question. Again, it wasn't a meaningless question to these people who pledged their lives, their fortunes,
and their sacred honor. That's right, absolutely.
On this endeavor. And then, again, going back to why is this important, and you go back to the experience of Lincoln and him always going back to the roots of our country, and what did he prophesy, if we got this right? The new birth of freedom. And so maybe we can wrap up, talking about this anniversary we have coming up. We're late boomers,
right.
late baby boomers, and we remember well 1976
I do.
And the celebration, the joyous celebration we had across the country. And it seems a little bit subdued this year. The opportunity we have to refocus on the Declaration, the 250th anniversary, and then to look forward, particularly for the younger folks who may not have the history that is in this book, again, the conservative book of the year, so I can't recommend it enough. But maybe just wrap up and reflect upon that in this anniversary we have coming up.
Yeah, no, I think it's important. I was in middle school in 1976. I remember it very fondly, and it sparked my interest in history. We have an opportunity to shape a lot of minds. We're behind. I mean, the previous administration, shall we say, did nothing, had done absolutely nothing, which is one reason I'm working very closely with the current administration to celebrate
You by the way, worked
250.
on in the first Trump administration, the president established a 1776 commission
I did
and wrote
that.
a great little book on the Declaration, which you can also look for as we reflect upon the year.
So there's something bigger going on here. I think it's very important. In that speech I referred to by Lincoln, where he referred to these Iron Men, he actually asked himself the question: what happens when they're all gone? What happens when we don't have this anymore? And he said, then we look back and read that old Declaration of Independence. And there we see that those old men said that all men are created equal. And we realize that that's the father of all moral sentiment in them and in us. And we realize that we too are blood of the blood and flesh of the flesh of those who fought the revolution. There's something very powerful in that. At the end of the day, this is about, why do you love your country? America's not perfect. We're fallen people. We make mistakes. There are triumphs and tragedies. But the thing we love is the thing we most deeply aspire to and stand for. It's our principles. It's the highest thing. And I would suggest to you that's the Declaration of Independence. All of our greatest efforts have pointed towards it, and all I can say is relearn the history, but relearn the principles and fall in love with your country again.
There you go.
Thank you.
That's it. Thank you, everybody. Good job.
Thank you.
Good job.